Hey everyone, it's your friend Joseph Craven here with a brand new segment on Running Out the Clock, The Numbers Game. This is going to be a weekly segment where we just break down all the scores and statistics and rankings of the week, the past week in college football, in particular in the SEC. Not a whole lot of opinion in this, just a whole lot of facts for those of you that maybe weren't aware of some of the things that went down this past weekend and want the details. That's all it is. That's all it will be. And I hope you enjoy it. We're moving into week 3 of college football, but we have to look back at week 2 real quick and run through some of the score lines that we saw. Number 18, Mississippi State Bulldogs defeated Kansas State in Manhattan, Kansas, 31-10. It was the return of quarterback Nick Fitzgerald for the Bulldogs, trying to make his debut in the Joe Moorhead offense. Not a stellar passing debut by any stretch of the imagination. In an offense that is supposed to be more vertical, downfield passing. He completed 11 of 27 passes for 154 yards, 2 touchdowns, which is good, but 1 interception, which is not as good. The storyline in this one, of course, was running back Kylan Hill, the sophomore, who averaged 12.4 yards per carry on his way to 211 rushing yards and 16 receiving yards. 2 touchdowns on the ground, 1 through the air. Well, on the ground as well. He caught it and then he ran it in. You understand. Kylan Hill was named SEC Offensive Player of the Week for his performance, in which he actually outgained Kansas State as a team. Fitzgerald did have a much better game on the ground, 19 carries for an 8.4 average, 159 rushing yards. So the passing game not working for the Bulldogs, but enough there to really make the running game dominate. I mean, anytime you put up, 370-something rushing yards, pretty significant. Along with that, in this ball game, Bulldogs defensive end Montez Sweat registered 3 tackles, 2 of them for a loss, and 1 sack as they won on the road. Sweat is now tied for the lead of the SEC in sacks and tackles for loss, and he's moved into 10th place in Mississippi State's career history in sacks with 14.5 sacks in only 15 games, so averaging almost a sack per game. Solid start to the year for the defensive end Montez Sweat. The Bulldogs now 2-0 and moving up in the polls. We'll talk about the polls in just a moment. Vanderbilt 2-0 as well after a 41-10 victory over Nevada. Commodore quarterback Kyle Shermer completed 23 of 32 passes for 258 yards and 2 touchdowns. And running back Keyshawn Vaughn rushed for 93 yards and 2 touchdowns on an 8.5 yard per carry average. The Commodore offense was alive in this game, a game that they took a lead in very early on and never, ever looked back. Number 1, Alabama welcomed Arkansas State to Tuscaloosa, and it was a 57-7 blowout victory. In this game, the Tide did not throw the ball a tremendous amount. Tua Tagovailoa came in started with 13 of 19 for 228 yards and 4 touchdowns. Jalen Hurts came in for 9 passing attempts, completed 7 of them for 93 yards and 2 touchdowns. Sophomore wide receiver Jerry Jeudy had 4 receptions for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns, with fellow sophomore Devonta Smith pulling in 77 yards and 1 touchdown. On the ground, the Tide were led by Najee Harris with 135 rushing yards and a touchdown. Behind him was fellow Harris, Damian Harris, the senior running back for the Tide, with 61 yards on the ground. Alabama holds steady to the number 1 spot in both the AP and the coaches poll. More on the polls to come. Number 3, Georgia traveled to Columbia, South Carolina to take on number 24, South Carolina. The Bulldogs went up 17-7 in the first quarter. South Carolina was able to get a field goal to bring it to 17-10, but then Georgia another field goal as well. It was 20-10 at the half, and the Georgia Bulldogs came out and with a 31-point third quarter ran away with this game and possibly the East. For the losing side, quarterback Jake Bentley completed 30 of 47 passes for 269 yards and a touchdown. And star wide receiver Deebo Samuel actually completed 1 pass for 13 yards and a touchdown as well. The Gamecocks had no luck on the ground. Tyson Williams and Rico Dowdle had 6 attempts and 7 attempts respectively for only 26 and 18 yards. Through the air, however, junior wideout Brian Edwards had a stellar performance, pulling in 7 receptions for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns on an almost 16-yard per reception average. On the other side, though, the Georgia Bulldogs were led, of course, by quarterback Jake Fromm, completing a highly efficient 15 of 18 passes for 194 yards, with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. There was a running back by committee sort of situation going on for the Bulldogs. Elijah Holyfield, DeAndre Swift, and Brian Herrion all had 76 yards, 64 yards, 45 yards, and a touchdown apiece. And through the air for the Dogs, wide receiver Mecole Hardman was the standout with 6 receptions for 103 yards and a touchdown. Ole Miss and Southern Illinois met in the highest scoring shootout of the weekend in the SEC. Southern Illinois, of course, had a minor lead at the half, and Ole Miss comes out and in the second half holds them to only a field goal, while they themselves scoring a stupid amount of points. 14 points in the third, 27 points in the fourth. There's a lot of offense to talk about here, so let's get into it. Jordan Ta'amu, 23 of 33 for 448 yards and 5 touchdowns. You had A.J. Brown with 158 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. Braylon Sanders with 133 yards and a touchdown through the air. You had DJ Metcalf with 93 yards and a touchdown through the air. And you even had Elijah Moore, a freshman, with 50 yards and a touchdown on his 1 reception of the game. Running back Scotty Phillips, someone that ROTC correspondent Chandler Rowland has been high on as far as his importance to the Rebels this year, had 107 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground, furthering the point that he is very necessary for Ole Miss to have a balanced offensive attack to help their defense out. If the defense can recover or not in time to take on the Crimson Tide this weekend is another question, but that's something that you'll have to listen to this week's episode of Running Out the Clock to figure out our opinions on. The Tennessee Volunteers notched the first victory under their new coaching regime with a 59-3 victory over East Tennessee State University. Quarterback Jarrett Guarantano completed 8 of 13 passes for 154 yards. And running backs Tim Jordan, Jeremy Banks, and Madre London all led the rushing attack for the Volunteers, with 65 yards, 62 yards and 2 touchdowns, and 47 yards and 2 touchdowns, respectively speaking. Not necessarily the most dynamic offensive statistics, it seems, but the key here for the Volunteers is that they had a really solid defensive performance. Freshman defensive back Bryce Thompson was named SEC Freshman of the Week. In his first start, he had an interception that he returned for 21 yards, 4 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and 1 pass breakup attempt. Or I guess you don't attempt a pass breakup, you break up the pass, don't you? So, never mind. In one of the biggest showdowns of the weekend, the Texas A&M Aggies almost got the better of the number 2 team in the country, the Clemson Tigers. It was 28-26. Of course, A&M getting most of their points in the second half in a comeback attempt. We've already discussed, and I'm sure you've heard, that Aggie quarterback Kellen Mond attempted 40 passes, completing 23 of them for 430 yards and 3 touchdowns. Really stellar through the air for Kellen Mond. It was, of course, the ground game that really was lacking for the Aggies here. Kellen Mond also was the leading rusher in terms of yardage for Texas A&M with a mere 33 yards on the ground. It was Kendrick Rogers, the 6'3 sophomore wide receiver, who really shone through, but he was assisted with Cameron Buckley for the Aggies. Rogers with 120 yards through the air and 2 touchdowns. Buckley, 93 yards. Number 11, Louisiana State University, took down Southeast Louisiana 31-0. Quarterback Joe Burrow was 50% completion percentage on the game, 10 of 20 for 151 yards and 2 touchdowns. And once again, they were led by the breakout running back star in the SEC, Nick Brossette, who rushed 19 times for 137 yards. He, however, did not have a touchdown. Those 2 rushing touchdowns on the day went to another running back, Clyde Edwards-Hilaire. I'm not going to pretend to pronounce Cajun names correctly, by the way. I love my brothers and sisters in Louisiana, but I cannot speak Louisianian. Quarterback Joe Burrow also added 1 touchdown on the ground as well. Brissett and Mississippi State running back Kylan Hill are the 2 breakout running back stars on the year. We'll get to their statistics later on, of course, but they're 2 names to keep in mind moving forward as possibly being surprise award nominees. That ultimately depends on how well their teams do. The Missouri Tigers are 2-0 after defeating Wyoming 40-13 this past weekend. Quarterback Drew Lock threw for 398 yards and 4 touchdowns on 33 of 45 passing. But not only that, he was aided on the ground by running back Demaria Crockett. Crockett added 73 yards on the ground, but it was Lock, surprisingly, that had a rushing touchdown on the game. 51 yards on the ground and a touchdown for Lock. Lock's favorite target, Emmanuel Hall, the 6'3 senior, pulled in 10 catches for 171 yards and a touchdown. Hall really emerging as one of the more dynamic receiving threats in the SEC. The Auburn Tigers were looking to really prove a point with their ground game in a little warm-up match against Alabama State. They scored a whopping 5 touchdowns on the ground. And interestingly enough, the carries were really dominated by a couple of freshmen, Jatarvius Whitlow and Sean Shivers. I should have looked that up before I hit record. The 2 freshmen rushed for 122 yards and 117 yards, respectively. And oddly enough, it was Cam Martin, the junior that many expected to be the star for the Tigers this season, who only got 7 carries for 40 yards, but he did get a touchdown on the ground. Quarterback Jarrett Stidham only attempted 11 passes, completing 6 of them for 133 yards and a touchdown. Of course, the storyline with Auburn is whether or not they can have a 1,000-yard rusher this year to keep their streak going. If the 2 freshmen, Whitlow and Shivers, continue to play well like this against tougher opponents, of course, then it'll be something to keep an eye out for. Excuse you, my dog just coughed into the microphone. Auburn, of course, had a very talented offense last season, and they're hoping to replicate that this year. Not off to a phenomenal start in their opening matchup against a top 10 opponent, of course, with a top 10 defense, of course. So they're really hoping that this is the type of warm-up game that they needed to have moving forward. Colorado State got the better of SEC team Arkansas 34-27. And while we've been reading the stats of the SEC players, we need to point out the stats here that matter. KJ Carter-Samuels, the Colorado State quarterback, threw 47 passes, completing 32 of them for 389 yards and 2 touchdowns with 1 interception. 2 Razorback quarterbacks saw the field as expected, Ty Storey and Cole Kelly. Kelly had the larger amount of yards with 102 and 2 touchdowns, and Storey threw more passes, but he only completed 5 of 13 for 36 yards and 2 interceptions. So moving forward, if this is any indication, it seems like Cole Kelly might be the choice for Chad Morris. We'll just have to find out. Running back Devwah Whaley put together the type of statistical performance that we expect out of the big boy. He rushed the ball 26 times, being the obvious Arkansas workhorse, for 165 yards and a touchdown, averaging 6.3 yards per carry. After an opening game where he didn't probably see the ball quite as often as he wanted to, this was a refreshing thing. However, of course, it is a loss, so Arkansas fans can't really enjoy his performance quite as much as they had hoped. Moving forward, it'll be interesting to see who it is that Morris stays with in terms of the quarterback position, and whether Morris can get the defense together well enough to complement his offense. The biggest news of the weekend, of course, was Kentucky beating number 25 Florida 27-16, breaking a 31-year-long streak that the Gators had over the Wildcats. Felipe Franks went 17 of 38 for 232 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. He also rushed the ball 11 times for 44 yards. LaMichael Pirine, Jordan Scarlett, Malik Davis, and Kadarius Toney all carried the ball for Florida. Pirine with 4 attempts, 34 yards. Scarlett, 7 attempts, 25 yards. Davis, 4 attempts, 15 yards. And Kadarius Toney only carrying the ball 2 times for 10 yards. Out of all of that, Perine had an 8.5 yard average, but Scarlett and Davis, Scarlett especially being the back that Florida fans expect to see the ball most of the time, only able to average 3.6 and 3.8 yards per carry. It was also the running backs that received a few targets in the air. Tony and Scarlett with 2 receptions, 35 and 34 yards, to lead the Gators in passing yardage, reception yardage, that is. Van Jefferson, the transfer from Ole Miss, had 2 receptions for 31 yards. And Freddie Swain, a junior from Ocala, Florida, had 3 receptions for 30 yards and one of the few touchdowns in the game. His touchdown, of course, being a significant one because it was the one late in the fourth quarter that made it look like maybe Florida could pull off the comeback. It's no surprise that on the other side of the ball, it was running back Benny Snell, who led the Wildcats with 175 rushing yards on 27 attempts. However, a potential breakout star here for Kentucky is newcomer transfer quarterback Terry Wilson, the 6'3", 205 dual threat quarterback, who led the Wildcats with 105 rushing yards and a touchdown and 151 yards through the air, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, on 11 of 16 passing. That's the full rundown of scores. What does this mean on the grand scheme of things? Well, in the top 25, we have 5 SEC teams currently represented. Alabama stays at both number 1 in both the AP and coaches polls. Georgia stays at number 3 in both polls as well. Auburn hangs on to the number 7 spot in AP and coaches polls. LSU has a little bit of movement, dropping down 1 spot to 12 in the AP poll, but moving up 2 spots to 13th in the coaches poll. Behind them are Mississippi State, moving from 18 to 16 in both coaches and AP polls. And that rounds out the 5 teams that are there. Florida and South Carolina drop out after their losses to conference opponents. But interestingly enough, neither Texas A&M, who had a good showing against the number 2 team in the country, or Kentucky, who upset a top 25 team in Florida, make it into either poll. They're both receiving votes in the AP and coaches polls. And along with them, Ole Miss and South Carolina are still receiving votes for the AP poll. South Carolina, Missouri, and even Vanderbilt got a vote for the coaches poll. Here's some of the standout performers on the week. We mentioned a few of them already. Mississippi State running back Kylan Hill won Offensive Player of the Week after a 200-yard ground game. That was 9th in Mississippi State history and first 200-yard game for a Mississippi State running back since Anthony Dixon did it back against Kentucky in 2009 with 252 yards, which I believe is the school record. Again, Hill ended with 227 all-purpose yards. Kansas State ended with 213. Hill perhaps poised for more of a breakout season under Joe Moorhead's offense than expected for the sophomore. The defensive player of the week was Josh Allen, the linebacker for Kentucky, one of the best linebackers in the country, bar none. Totaled 5 tackles, 1.5 for loss, 1 quarterback sack, 1 fumble caused, and 1 pass breakup, and a quarterback hurry. Man, a busy day for Allen against the Florida Gators. His sack on the game's final play, of course, caused a fumble that Kentucky recovered for a controversial touchdown. He also had the pass breakup on the 2-point conversion in the fourth quarter. So Allen really sealing the game for the Wildcats. Special teams player of the week, Georgia place kicker Rodrigo Blankenship. 2 for 2 on field goals, 44 and 45 yards, and hit all 5 point-after attempts in the 41-17 victory over South Carolina. It was his 44-yarder as time expired in the first half that stretched the lead to 10 points, giving them momentum that they would take advantage of in that big-time third quarter. Mentioned before, Bryce Thompson, the defensive back for Tennessee, had his first start against East Tennessee State, had an interception, 4 tackles, 2 for loss, and 1 pass breakup. Offensive lineman of the week is Gervontius Bunchy Stallings, having the best nickname of the week as well. An offensive lineman, a guard for Kentucky. He had 23 blocks at the point of attack. Kentucky, of course, rushed for 303 yards, averaging 7.4 yards per attempt. Perhaps most importantly, on 3rd and 1 with about 2 minutes and 30 seconds left, and UK hanging on to that 21-16 lead, Stallings pulled left and delivered a crushing block that sprang Benny Snell for a 20-yard gain. UK was able to take another couple minutes off the clock, forcing Florida to take over its final possession with only 29 seconds remaining. Most notably, this is the second time in a row that Kentucky has had two players rush for 100 yards in one game, but it is the first time that Kentucky has done it in 39 years. Bunchy Stallings really being one of the key players in that performance. And finally, as mentioned before, Montez Sweat, defensive end for Mississippi State, was the defensive lineman of the week. With that, let's look at the stats currently through week 2 so we can get a bit more of an understanding of where all these players are. Top 5 passers in the conference in terms of yardage are Ole Miss quarterback Jordan Ta'amu with 784 yards and 7 touchdowns. Missouri quarterback Drew Lock behind him, 687 yards and 8 touchdowns. Kellen Mond now has 614 yards and 5 touchdowns. Jake Bentley of South Carolina has 519 yards, 5 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. And in 5th place, Tua Tagovailoa has 455 yards and 6 touchdowns on the year. Key Ole Miss running back Scotty Phillips currently leads the conference in rushing yards with 311. But right behind him at this point is Kentucky running back Benny Snell with 300 yards. Texas A&M's Travion Williams has 271. And as mentioned, the 2 breakout running back stars so far at this point in the season, Nick Brossette of LSU and Kylan Hill of Mississippi State, have 262 and 261 rushing yards through the second week of the season. Missouri's Emmanuel Hall is the leading receiver so far with 342 yards through 2 games, which is a stupid amount. A.J. Brown of Ole Miss, 251 yards behind him. Another Ole Miss wide receiver, Braylon Sanders, 193 behind him. Devontae Smith of Alabama has 176 yards. And then Ole Miss wide receiver DK Metcalf is in 5th place with 174 yards. Those Ole Miss wide receivers really living up to their billing so far. Defensively speaking, there are 2 players that currently have 3 sacks on the year through the first 2 games. That's Montez Sweat and Kenny, I believe it's Hebert, the linebacker from Vanderbilt. It could be Herbert, but I prefer Hebert, if it is. Armon Watts, Josh Allen, Armon Watts from Arkansas, Josh Allen from Kentucky, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson from Florida, Isaiah Buggs from Alabama, Dylan Moses from Alabama, Grant Delpit from LSU, and Big Cat Bryant from Auburn all have 2 sacks as well. So do Breeden Fehoko from LSU, Michael Divinity Jr., and Neil Farrell Jr., all from LSU. LSU getting some pressure on the ball these days, it seems like, really standing out there. So all of them happen to have 2 sacks, but the 2 leaders right now are Montez Sweat and Kenny Hebert. That's how it's spelled, Hebert. As far as interceptions go, there are a slew of players that have 1 interception so far in the year, but only one has multiple interceptions so far, and that's Daniel Thomas from Auburn. Looking at some quick team statistics before we wrap things up, Texas A&M leads the conference in yards per game of total offense, 1,259. Ole Miss behind them, 1,192. Mississippi State with 1,156. Missouri in 4th place, 1,154. And Alabama in 5th place, 1,111 total yards so far. As far as defensive yards allowed, well, first of all, it's kind of harder to find this in any sort of organized way on the internet, just so you know. Like, just do a quick search for like defensive yards allowed, and you can't really separate it by conference or anything like that, so it's pretty weird. Anyway, currently in the SEC, Mississippi State allows only 213 yards through the first 2 games of the season, leading the conference. Missouri has 248 yards allowed so far. Vanderbilt is 3rd with 272 yards allowed. Kentucky, 4th place with 307.5 yards allowed. And Alabama is in 5th place in the conference, 335 yards allowed per game so far on the year. Those are going to be the numbers for week 2 in college football for the SEC. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Numbers Game. If you like it, let me know what else you'd like to hear as far as statistics go moving forward throughout the season, but we are going to be putting up these little statistics-based episodes every week to keep you up to date on who's doing what, who's leading the team in what, who's leading the conference rather, in what statistical categories, and what this means in terms of who's up in the polls and who's down in the polls. Obviously, a whole lot more debate and discussion will come into play on some of the other episodes of Running Out the Clock that we put out throughout the year. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure that you leave a little rating on iTunes or Google Play or wherever it is that you listen to Running Out the Clock. And that's going to do it for me. I'm your friend Joseph Craven. Thank you for listening to this, the inaugural episode, hopefully not the last one, of The Numbers Game on ROTC Sports.